We're going to have a look at sessions 14 and 15, and due to the flooding today and lectures being cancelled as a result, I'm going to go through this in a little bit more detail. We previously considered that aggregate demand consists of consumption, investment and government spending. We haven't worried too much about net exports, but it's important to consider an open economy, particularly when we see that in recent times economies have become more interrelated, interconnected with globalization. So South Africa is affected by what happens internationally, international economic influences. So when, for example, a major economic player like the United States moves into recession, that tends to have a dampening effect on other economies. When it moves into expansion, it tends to stimulate other economies. So South Africa, as a major player within sub-Saharan Africa, also has effect on its neighbouring economies. When we export goods, things like our wine, fruit, grapes, oranges, etc., even though the goods are going abroad, it represents an injection into the South African circular flow because it represents an increased demand for our goods, domestically produced goods, which increases our output and income here. As opposed to when we import, say, a car or a cell phone from abroad, that represents a leakage from our circular flow. It represents spending on foreign goods. So the price of a country's goods relative to its competitors has an impact on, obviously, the demand for our domestically produced goods. But it's not only the price charged by local producers that affects that competitiveness, but the exchange rate does as well. If, for instance, there's a depreciation of the rand, say, relative to the US dollar, that's going to make our imports from the US more expensive. So when the rand depreciates, it's more expensive for us to import from America, but our exports to Americans become cheaper as a result of that depreciation. On the other hand, if the rand appreciates relative to the US dollar, our exports become more expensive to US citizens, whereas it becomes cheaper for us to import from America as a result of that appreciation of the rand. So exchange rate also affects this competitiveness. But as I said before, be very careful to jump to the conclusion that a depreciation is always a good thing. I explained that in lectures previously. Economies are linked through two ways, so two broad channels. So number one is this trade in goods and services, but they're also linked through finance. And this became very evident in 2007-2008 with the collapse of US securities, which kind of reverberated around much of the world, as to how extensively economies are linked. So South African residents, households, banks, corporations, they can hold either South African assets or foreign assets. So you can purchase South African treasury bills, corporate bonds, or you could hold some assets in foreign countries like in Canada or Germany, for instance. So portfolio managers are constantly shopping the world to find the most attractive yields. So they're linking asset markets. And this is the ability of affecting how monetary policy can influence the interest rates. So this is something that's important to us and we will talk more about later on. So whilst the US is considered a relatively closed economy, its trade links are still important. A country like Singapore is extremely open. Imports and exports form a large share of total GDP. In South Africa, our exports constitute roughly a third of GDP, or roughly 28% of GDP, as opposed to our imports, which constitute a greater share of GDP, 33%. So we hence we're running a deficit on our current account, which we're going to talk about now, because we're going to have a look at the balance of payments. So we're going to have a look at what the balance of payments is, and it's two major accounts. So the balance of payments records all the transactions of the residents of a particular country with the rest of the world. And the two major accounts that we're interested in are the current account and the financial or capital account. The current account is basically your trade balance. It records all trade in goods, trade in services, plus any net transfers. So transfer payments are things like remittances, gifts, grants. So if, for instance, a worker sends income home to their family, that would be a transfer payment. It would be recorded under the current account. Your financial account records the actual purchases and sales of assets, things like stocks, bonds, and land. The actual capital flow goes onto the capital or financial account, whereas any interest, net interest income, it was recorded on the current account. So for instance, interest on loans is actually recorded on the current account. Service payment goes onto the current account. It's important that if you run a current account deficit, so say for instance your trade balance, your imports are greater than your exports, so you're running a current account deficit, for instance, that would have to be financed by a financial or capital account surplus to avoid bankruptcy. We're going to talk about that now. But just note too that on the balance of payments you might see another account that's referred to called the capital transfer account. And what that is, although you won't be tested on it explicitly, it's any aid from a donor, for instance, with no expectation of repayment. So it's an amount of money that moves without there having to be the creation of an asset or liability position. That's what is referred to on the capital transfer account. And then you'll also see an item, if you look for instance here, this is the South African balance of payments, you'll also see an item where they refer to any change in net gold or other foreign reserves. So that's a change in South Africa's official reserves, government's holdings of foreign currency and gold. So let's look at examples of deficit and surplus items. When you import a cell phone or you make a gift payment to a foreigner, you purchase a flat abroad, got a deposit in a Swiss bank account, those are all deficit items on your balance of payments, as opposed to surplus items when we export our chemicals, for instance, and earn income in the process. Those will be surplus items on your balance of payments. You can go through some of those examples. So going back to this South African balance of payments here, you'll see that we tend to run a current account deficit, here shown with these negatives. Same applies currently, running a current account deficit. So your trade balance is basically in deficit there. And that needs to be offset by a financial account surplus, as you can see there. So why is this the case? And I think it's easiest to think of an individual, relate this to an individual. The central point of international payments is simple, that you have to be able to pay for what you buy internationally. So if an individual were to spend more than their income, that deficit would have to be financed by selling assets or borrowing. So you'd have to sell something that you own, or you'd have to borrow from somebody if you were running a deficit. Similarly, if a country runs a deficit in its current account, that deficit has to be financed by selling assets or by borrowing abroad. So if you sell or borrow from foreigners, it implies that you're running a capital account surplus. So as I said, any current account deficit, say your trade balance is deficit, it's of necessity going to be financed by an offsetting capital inflow. If a country's got no assets to sell, if it's got no foreign currency reserves to use up, and nobody's prepared to lend to it, it's going to have to achieve balance then in the current account, however painful and difficult that may be. So the financial account is split into two separate parts. There's all the transactions of the country's private sector, and then those of the central bank. So private residents can sell assets here internationally or borrow internationally, or your central bank can run down their foreign exchange reserves by selling foreign currency in the foreign exchange market. Likewise, if you're running a current account surplus, private residents could use that foreign exchange revenue to pay off your debt or assets that you purchased from abroad. Foreign currency can also be bought by the central bank, adding currency to its reserves. If overall your balance of payments is in deficit, your central bank is obviously going to run down its reserves, and it cannot continue doing that indefinitely. If both your current and your private capital accounts are in surplus, your central bank will obviously be adding to its reserves. And if the one account is in surplus and the other in deficit by precisely the same amount, your balance of payments would exactly equal zero in that instance. Okay, we're going to take a look at exchange rates. So I'm just going to switch to the DocCam view to do so. And let's take a look at the exchange rates today against the US dollar. So at the moment, it would cost you 14 Rand 27 cents to purchase $1 US. That is what we refer to as the direct method of quoting an exchange rate. So an exchange rate is basically the price of one currency in terms of another. So it's a ratio, and I think that's probably what confuses people. While when some people go on holiday abroad, they find it difficult to work the exchange rate out because it's a ratio. The direct method of quotation is how many units of domestic currency does it take to purchase 1 unit of foreign currency. And that's the typical way we see exchange rates quoted and that we're familiar with. The indirect method of quotation shows you for 1 unit of domestic currency how much of the foreign currency can you purchase. So 1 South African rand will get you 0.07 US dollars. A little bit depressing when you quote it that way around. So these are the different ways of quoting an exchange rate. I'm going to switch back now to our lecture slides. From the end of World War II to about 1973, most of the major countries had fixed exchange rates against one another. Now we see countries that have got free floating exchange rates, some that have got pegged exchange rates, some with a soft peg, others with a hard peg. So soft peg, for instance, China, where they allow the exchange rate to adjust, but within a band. So there's an upper and a lower band within which they allow that exchange rate to move. So that's a soft peg. In an extreme case like Zimbabwe, we could consider that as almost a very hard peg. They have no local currency. There's dollarization. They have adopted another country's currency, the US dollar, as legal tender. So they have relinquished control over their monetary policy. They can't influence the interest rates and output in the process. A little country like Liechtenstein too depends on the Swiss franc as its legal tender. We'll talk a little bit more about different exchange rates over the page. But if you have a fixed exchange rate, for example in the 60s, your German central bank, the Bundesbank, would buy or sell any amount of dollars at 4 Deutschmark, that was the currency, per US dollar. So they'd have to be prepared to buy or sell any amount of foreign currency to keep the Deutschmark pegged or fixed at that rate. So your central bank holds reserves to sell this foreign exchange when they have to intervene in the foreign exchange market. So as long as the central bank has got the necessary reserves, it can continue to intervene in the foreign exchange market to keep the exchange rate constant. However, if you were to persistently run a deficit in your balance of payments, your central bank will eventually start to run out of reserves and would be unable to continue its intervention. And before this occurs, it would probably devalue the currency. And please note this different terminology. It's a devaluation as opposed to depreciation. We use the term depreciation when the currency is able to float, is able to adjust, as opposed to a devaluation where you have a more fixed exchange rate. Flexible exchange rates or floating exchange rates are where the central banks allow the exchange rate to adjust to equate the supply and demand for foreign currency. So it allows, like sort of, if you like to think of it like a free market, leaving the market alone to equate supply and demand. Although central banks can and do intervene to some extent. So sometimes we get clean floating where there's no intervention by central banks. So your official reserve transactions on the balance of payments will be equal to zero because they just allow the exchange rate to adjust. But in other instances, you get a dirty or a managed float where the central bank does intervene to buy and sell foreign currency in an attempt to try and influence the exchange rate. So there's just a note you can go through on these different terms. A depreciation, the under floating rates, when a currency becomes less expensive in terms of foreign currency, we would refer to it as the depreciation. So, for instance, the rand, we would say, has depreciated relative to the dollar or the pound, as opposed to a devaluation, which is where the price of a foreign currency is under a fixed exchange rate regime is influenced or increased by official action. And likewise, with an appreciation, the equivalent term would be a revaluation if there was a fixed exchange rate system. Finally, we want to consider the exchange rate in the long run. And we have this idea of purchasing power parity. This is a notion that a dollar, for instance, should buy the same amount in all countries. And in the long run, an exchange rate between two countries should move towards the rate that equalizes the price of an identical basket of goods and services in each country. And The Economist magazine started taking a fun look, tongue-in-cheek guide to PPP, Purchasing Power Parity, with its McDonald's or Big Mac index. And it seems to be very popular and has continued through the years. And you can have a look on the internet and find the Big Mac guide for 2019. And this idea is an extension of this. It's our basket here is not really a representative basket of a whole lot of goods and services. It's just a Big Mac burger in this instance. But the Big Mac PPP is the idea that the exchange rate should adjust so that a hamburger costs the same in one country as it would abroad. And it's a way of comparing your actual exchange rate with these purchasing power parities, indicates whether the country is under or overvalued. And we see that if you have a look at the Big Mac index, the Swiss franc, for instance, continues to remain overvalued, the South African rand undervalued. So it's a kind of a tongue-in-cheek guide, but it's fun to have a look at, and it does, in many instances, it does correctly suggest which currencies are under or overvalued. So the notion is, though, that in the long run the exchange rate should adjust so that the relative purchasing power of a currency within each country is the same. So two countries would be at purchasing power parity, as we said, when a unit of domestic currency can buy the same basket of goods at home or abroad. And we get this equation here for the real exchange rate. And it says that your real exchange rate is the nominal exchange rate, E there, that's the exchange rate quoted in the markets, times by your an index for foreign prices over that of domestic prices here. So if, for instance, we take a rise in, let's take a rise in the domestic price level, what effect is that going to have on the real exchange rate? And in order to understand this, I'm going to switch once more to the DocCam view and take an example with you. Okay, let's say that, so we say the real exchange rate is equal to the nominal exchange rate times by foreign price level over the domestic price level. And let's say that your exchange rate, to keep things simple, your nominal exchange rate is 1:1. So 1 rand buys you, say, $1. Okay, so we're going to take 1 rand buys you $1. So I'm just going to put 1 there for your nominal exchange rate. If you start off and let's say your price level is the same in each country, take it as 100, your price index in each country, both in, say, the United States and in South Africa, you'll see that these cancel each other out and you get a value of 1. So your real exchange rate is equal to 1. And you've got purchasing power parity. You can buy the same amount. When you convert your currency, you can buy the same basket of goods in each economy. But what happens if prices rise in South Africa relative to those abroad? So let's say this domestic price level were to go up. So let's keep the nominal exchange rate the same, so it's 1:1 there. And we'll keep foreign price index at the same amount, but let's say the domestic price level has risen by 10%. You're going to get, you're dividing by a greater amount, so this value, R, is going to fall. And you're going to get a value, if you divide this out, you're going to get 0.9, roughly. So R, your real exchange rate, is now below 1. So it shows you that when the South African price index rises, this suggests that the real exchange rate is below 1. Okay, let's go back to the slides to interpret that. So we see that when we get the situation that we've just worked out, where R is less than 1, we got a value of 0.9. It suggests that foreign goods are cheaper than those at home, which is what we worked out, because the South African price index had risen, and it correctly suggests that foreign goods are therefore cheaper than those at home. And if we were to take that same equation, and if the foreign price level were to rise, this time, so that's 110, and you divide this by 100 and you keep E at 1, not changing your nominal exchange rate, you'd see that you'd get a value greater than 1. 110 over 100 times by 1, R would be greater than 1. And foreign goods, it suggests foreign goods, this is greater than that. Foreign goods are more expensive than at home. Whereas if R is equal to 1, currencies are at purchasing power parity. And remember what that means. A unit of domestic currency can buy the same basket of goods at home or internationally. So have a look at the Big Mac Index. Fun way of seeing which countries, like here you can see South Africa, and it suggests that South Africa and the PPP using the Big Mac Index that was released in January 2019 suggests that South Africa and its rand is still undervalued. Economies like Switzerland, as it shows you there, Norway, Sweden, etc., Eurozone, the euro, still suggests they remain overvalued. And there are things that prevent the exchange rate, the real exchange rate, from moving too far away from PPP, but at the same time they work only slowly. And that's because there's barrier of movement of goods between countries. So we've got to consider that the transport costs, and this prevents the equalization cost of a basket of goods across countries. There are tariff barriers that countries impose. And there are also many goods that are non-tradable, can't move. So if you think, even if you take the Big Mac Index as an example, you have rent that, for example, in Paris along the Champs-Élysées, it would cost you a lot more in rent, and because you can't move land, and this leads to the fact that there isn't a perfect movement of this exchange rate towards PPP. It prevents that movement. Okay, so that ends the session on international linkages.